My cellmate had the label of a child predator slapped on him, and every day he was brutalized by both inmates and guards. But then he told me the soul-shattering truth about why he actually called his own kid, and I've never felt so torn. I was in the second year of a 3-year bid when this bald guy with a thick mustache named Carl was brought in as my new cellmate. The guard who escorted him kicked him hard in the back before locking our cell. Then, standing just beyond the bars, he smirked and told me not to talk about my kid around this freak. I shot up immediately. My own child had been assaulted before, so I walked straight over to Carl and asked point blank what he'd done to those kids. But he didn't answer. He just stared at me with these hollow, defeated eyes, the same kind I'd only seen in inmates who were wrongly convicted. I backed off. But my suspicions stayed, so I kept a close eye on him. And what I saw, it was about what I expected. Everyone knows what happens to so-called predators inside, and Carl was no exception. During his first breakfast, someone poured boiling coffee on his hands. That same afternoon in the yard, this guy named Red jabbed him in the ribs with a sharpened screw. That night, back in the cell, I saw him trying to pee through blood. The guards were just as bad, if not worse. I remember Carl filing a request to see medical after cracking a rib in a fall. He never even got a reply. Another time, I saw a guard come in after lights out, just to beat the hell out of him. One even stabbed him in the shoulder with a jagged piece of glass. And the weirdest part? Despite all of it, Carl was the kindest person I'd ever met. He shared his painkillers with me when medical ignored my own injuries. He fixed the busted wheelchair of a vet who'd lost both legs. And when one of the new inmates found out his daughter had passed away, Carl was the one who held him like only a father who'd buried his own child could. Everything shifted the day I was alone in the laundry room. I had just managed to save up $800 to buy my daughter a textbook she needed for college, and I was trying to figure out how to convince her mom to spend it on that instead of pills. That's when Red, a former trafficker doing life, cornered me with one of his guys. He said he'd heard from a guard that I had money in my account, and unless I handed it over, I could forget about ever seeing my daughter again. Then he pressed a small blade to my throat and told me I had 10 seconds to choose. I remember my mouth going dry, trying to think of a way out. "Look, Red, maybe we can—" But then his guy screamed. Red spun around to find Carl driving a red-hot iron into the man's back. His face went ghost white, and Carl didn't hesitate. He lunged and pressed the iron against Red's cheek too. Red crumpled to the floor, howling. So did the other guy. Carl and I scrambled out of the laundry room. That night, Carl told me he'd overheard what Red said. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and said he once had a daughter too, and that anyone who threatens the bond between a father and his child deserves to suffer. But standing up to Red came at a price. The next day, guards pulled Carl out and dragged him to the warden's office. I don't know what went down, but after that, he disappeared into solitary for a full month. When he came back, he was broken. He had fresh bruises, like someone had managed to reach him even in solitary. He was gaunt, sunken, barely more than skin and bone. When I asked the guard what had happened, he just told me to mind my business, unless I wanted the same. By then, Red was out of the infirmary, which meant things were only going to get worse. 4 days later, I was waiting outside the showers for Carl to finish up when a guard approached me. He told me, for my own good, I should head back to my cell. I said no. I was waiting for Carl. The guard didn't argue. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo of my daughter, then asked if I was sure I wanted to stay. The message was clear. I knew what was about to happen, and I hated myself for it, but I walked away. Because if it came down to Carl or my daughter, I didn't have a choice. I remember just grinding.
I clenched my teeth in frustration before turning around and walking off. The moment I did, I heard the dull thud of a punch, then muffled screams, and then that horrible sizzling sound again. My eyes started to sting. Carl didn't come back to our cell until a few hours later. By then, he'd already been cleared from the infirmary. He had 4 broken ribs, a shattered nose, third-degree burns across his back and chest. 2 of his teeth had been yanked out, and yet, according to him, medical barely gave him a glance. No pain meds, no overnight stay. They didn't even stitch him up, just wrapped his wounds in blood-soaked bandages and walked him back like nothing happened. As soon as the door shut behind him, he collapsed right there on the floor. Couldn't even make it to his bunk. He didn't say a word, just lay there, barely breathing, making these awful, wounded animal sounds. I dropped to my knees beside him. I told him I was sorry, that I wanted to help, but they'd threatened my daughter. Carl didn't even look angry. He said I made the right call, said he'd have chosen his daughter over me, too. That's when, still lying there on the concrete, Carl asked if I wanted to know the real reason he was locked up. I nodded. He gathered what little strength he had and sat up, groaning as he did. "It's true," he said. "I did call my own child." I felt my stomach drop, my whole body tensed. "Go on," I managed, barely. "But only," he added, "because I found out he was working with Red." I stared at Carl's battered face as he forced the words out. Down the hallway, I could hear Red's crew gathering outside the infirmary, no doubt planning their next move. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting jagged shadows over Carl's swollen face. He shifted on the floor, wincing hard as more blood soaked through his wrappings. His hands trembled as he leaned back against the wall. Through cracked lips and broken teeth, he whispered something that hit me harder than any punch ever could. "My son, Eli. He started small, running packages when he turned 20. Told me it was just for extra cash." His voice broke. His hands trembled more violently now, like they couldn't hold back the storm inside him. Carl's son, not a stranger, not a victim. His own flesh and blood. I leaned in closer, my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of it all. Carl went on, each word coming slower, heavier. He said Eli escalated fast. Packages across state lines became fake documents, IDs. Then it turned into people. Desperate souls looking for safety and hope, only to end up trafficked like property. My stomach turned. Red wasn't Carl's first brush with this kind of evil. This wasn't about prison politics anymore. This was Carl's life bleeding into the present. Just then, a faint scraping sound made us freeze. It was Luis, my work detail partner from 2 cells down. He'd slid a folded note under our door. I snatched it up and opened it with shaky fingers. "Bookie paying guards triple for special handling tonight. Watch your backs." Carl saw my face drain of color and didn't even ask. He already knew. He pushed himself upright from the wall, his body screaming in protest, but his decision written clearly in his eyes. He would tell me everything before Red's people got to him for good. With every movement, blood bloomed through his bandages, spreading out in thick, dark stains like silent accusations. Then the lights cut out. Not a flicker, not a power save mode. Full blackout. "Maintenance," said the automated system. But we both knew that was a lie. This was deliberate. This was opportunity. In the pitch dark, Carl's voice found me. He told me how he'd discovered the truth, boxes hidden in their garage, photographs of terrified girls, price tags written right on the photos, shipping manifests where people were listed as freight, bank statements with deposits no legal job could explain. The backup generator sputtered to life, bathing the world in a sickly yellow glow. My skin crawled. 2 of Red's guys were already at our cell door, spinning a keyring that clearly wasn't theirs. Behind them, a guard stood openly counting a fat stack of cash, didn't even bother to pretend he wasn't in on it. Carl stepped in front of me, even with everything broken inside him. His legs were shaking, but he stood. But Carl's voice didn't waver. He told them he'd go quietly if they left me alone. Just him. No one else had to get hurt. The men laughed, a sound like shattered glass. The taller one, a guy I recognized from kitchen duty, shook his head, said that wasn't an option. Red wanted both of us now. Me for the disrespect of getting involved. Carl for the permanent damage he'd left on their boss's face. They were fumbling with the lock when a sudden outburst came from the next cell. Wallace, an old-timer who'd been watching Carl quietly help people for weeks, suddenly grabbed at his chest and collapsed, howling about chest pain. "Can't breathe! Need help! No!" The performance was worthy of an Oscar. The guard swore under his breath, clearly caught between the bribe he'd taken and the liability of a dead inmate. Wallace sold it perfectly. He even managed to wink at Carl while groaning in agony. The guard didn't have a choice. He called for medical, and within moments the hallway filled with personnel. Red's goons slipped away into the shadows, their shot ruined, for now. As the med team swarmed Wallace's miraculous recovery, Red himself appeared at our door. His burns were wrapped, but his eyes were ablaze with something darker than pain. He gripped the bars, knuckles bone white, and laid out his offer. He'd spill everything about Eli, every detail, every victim, every piece of the horror if Carl ended his own life that night. One death in exchange for the full truth. I opened my mouth to tell Red exactly where he could shove his deal. But Carl's hand gripped my arm. His hold was weak, but it held weight. I looked at his face and saw something that shook me to the core. He was actually considering it. With trembling hands, Carl reached under his mattress and pulled out a photo. The edges were soft from wear, the image faded but intact. A young man, 18 years old, beaming at graduation. Every line of his face filled with promise. Carl's voice cracked completely as he held it up to Red. He asked, "When did Eli first contact you?" The photo shook in his grasp, blood from his bandaged fingers staining the white border. Red's smile was poison. He said Eli came to him at 21, already experienced, already driven. He didn't just want in, he wanted to expand the operation, go from running product to moving people. He had plans, business plans, talked about scaling up, profit margins, market saturation. Before Red could go any further with his twisted pitch, the warden's voice cut through the intercom. "Surprise cell inspections, effective immediately. All inmates remain in cells. Non-essential personnel clear the block." Red's goons slipped away like roaches when the lights come on. Even Red himself had to retreat, but not before promising this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The inspection itself was a joke. The warden walked in and stepped right over the blood still pooling at Carl's feet without a second glance. He looked over Carl, saw the bruises, the leaking bandages, the swollen face, the way he could barely keep upright, and scribbled something on his clipboard. No issues noted. Then just before walking out, I saw him bend down and pick up a small envelope Red had dropped. He slipped it into his pocket without hesitation. Another payoff. Once we were alone again, Carl told me about hiring a private investigator when Eli's behavior first began to change. Said the guy was experienced, worked missing persons for 2 decades. He got close. Sent Carl detailed updates, names, movements, how Eli's wealth was ballooning. Then the reports stopped. The PI's office was torn apart. His car was found in the river. His body never surfaced. I helped Carl back to his bunk while he talked, trying to make him comfortable, though comfort seemed impossible at that point. The next morning arrived like a slap. While Carl limped through his required laps in the yard, Santos approached. I'd noticed him before, a lifer, always watching Carl from afar, expression unreadable. This time he came close, rolled up his sleeves to reveal a map of knife scars across both arms. "I knew your boy, Eli, back on the outside," he said flatly. Carl froze mid-step. For a second I thought he might fall, but he stayed upright. Santos spoke with chilling detachment. Said Eli was young, smart, completely ruthless. He targeted teenagers because they were easier to break, in his own words. Then he held out his arms. Those scars, Eli gave them to him personally, back when Santos tried to protect his cousin.
Martinez's voice dropped. He said he'd been working maintenance at the courthouse during Eli's hearings, but until now he'd never mentioned what he saw. Now, with everything coming to a head, he told me the truth. The lawyer defending Eli wasn't just skilled, he was untouchable. Connections, money, favors from high places. Martinez had seen judges bend under pressure, seen files disappear from courtrooms, seen bailiffs turn a blind eye. He remembered one specific hearing where 2 key witnesses simply didn't show. One had vanished days before. The other was found dead, ruled a suicide even though the details never made sense. And through it all, Eli sat there in his pressed suit, calm as ice, looking like someone's promising son instead of the architect of a human trafficking empire. Even Martinez, hardened from years of inside knowledge, seemed rattled. He told me he'd kept his head down all this time, afraid that saying anything might make him disappear too. Back in the cell, Carl was still clutching the photograph of the child's sneaker. He hadn't spoken since breakfast. His face was slack, gray, like someone already halfway to the grave. The note still sat beside him. "She fought harder than you did." The cruelty of it wasn't just a threat. It was the deliberate echo of Carl's past. The shoe was the same brand he'd once bought for Eli, back when things were still okay, before everything fell apart. I sat down beside him and tried to get through, to say something that might reach him. But Carl was lost in the weight of it all. His failures as a father, the trail of victims his son had left behind, the way the system had protected Eli at every turn. Later that night, when the lights dimmed again, I saw Carl writing more letters. Not to Marcus this time. These were addressed to families, to victims, to the girls he could name from memory now. Each word carved out of guilt, each sentence heavy with grief. He knew he couldn't fix anything, but he still tried. The silence in the cell was broken only by the scratch of pen on paper, and Carl's quiet, labored breathing.
The lawyer, infamous in legal circles, was known for making trafficking charges vanish. Technicalities, discredited evidence, lost files. That was his specialty. Carl had tried to go through the proper channels. He brought everything he had to Detective Harmon. Photos, documents, bank records, hard evidence he'd collected himself. Harmon looked through it all, then calmly warned Carl that if he didn't drop it, he'd be charged with harassment. 6 months later, Harmon took early retirement. His pension didn't line up with his years of service. The sun was setting the day Red's final ultimatum came. Delivered through go-betweens, the terms were simple. Carl could learn everything about the girl, Emily, 9 years old, but only if he agreed to take his own life afterward. The truth, Red promised, would be his final punishment. That evening, Chen, one of the guys from the library wing, approached Carl. I'd heard Chen brag about his cybercrimes, identity theft, fraud, even laundering. But now, there was no bravado in his voice. With a guilt he didn't try to hide, Chen confessed that he'd once helped Eli build fake identities for trafficking victims. New names, clean records, documents that would pass any check. That night, Carl's fever spiked from untreated infections. In his delirium, he kept calling out for Eli, begging forgiveness, not just from his son, but from every child his son had hurt. Inmates around us turned away. Even men with murder raps couldn't stomach it. Then another message came from Red, a photograph. Emily, before Eli got to her. 9 years old, frosting on her nose at her birthday party, smiling wide, friends cheering beside her. That photo sent a chill through the block like a cold wind. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Card games froze. Even the usual noise of prison life, the shouting, the trash talk, the banging, fell into silence. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt the same thing. That line had been crossed. Carl stared at Emily's picture with the focus of a detective. He recognized the neighborhood instantly, just 2 blocks from his own home. Her school uniform? From the same elementary school Eli once attended. Realizing his son had hunted victims right there in their own community cracked something deep inside Carl. And the inmates who once avoided him started to shift too. A guy from the south side set an extra tray on our table. The Muslims silently included Carl in their yard circle. Even some of the guards stopped looking Red's way. Through the contraband phone network, families started digging. Photos came in from a storage unit Eli had abandoned. Carl recognized the items immediately. Trophies. A charm bracelet he'd seen on Eli's first girlfriend. A class ring from a school Eli never attended. Every item represented a shattered life. And Carl, he told me everything. How he'd tried so hard to save Eli. Family meetings, therapists, arrests. He'd even called the police on his own son after a violent outburst. But each time, money stepped in. Charges dropped, witnesses disappeared. The system that was supposed to protect people had shielded a predator instead. Carl made his decision public. He would not take Red's offer. Death would be a release he didn't deserve. He'd live with it, carry the burden, bear witness. During shower time, Carl found Red. He looked him in the eyes and said it outright. I already know what Eli did to Emily. I saw the aftermath. Red's smug expression collapsed. It was like watching water drain from a shattered glass. Carl's condition was failing fast, but he traded what he could, commissary, favors, for expired antibiotics hoarded by another inmate. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. And then Red's people started breaking away. Hearing what Eli had done to Emily, that shifted things. Even men who'd done brutal things had their limits. A few refused to be associated with it. And then came the moment that changed everything. Big Tom, shot caller for the entire block, stood up during evening rec, made it loud. Carl was under his protection now. Tom's granddaughter? She was the same age as Emily, and just the thought of it turned his stomach.
Anyone who moved against Carl now had to answer to Big Tom personally. The prison's underground network, usually reserved for smuggling contraband, turned its focus toward truth. Inmates started contacting people on the outside, old connections, friends, even family, to dig into Carl's claims of police corruption. Evidence began to surface. Photos of Detective Harmon's shiny new boat, bank records showing deposits that lined up exactly with the dates charges against Eli were dropped. Carl began sharing more about Eli's final hunt. Phone logs had led him to Emily, but only after she was already gone. She had escaped wherever Eli had been keeping her, but she was 9, terrified, and completely alone. She vanished, trying to find her way home. Word spread fast. Carl had tried every legitimate route before taking justice into his own hands. He'd filed reports, hired attorneys, contacted federal agencies, and every time the doors were slammed in his face. The system protected Eli while a little girl disappeared into the dark. Red's grip on power started to crumble. His crew began questioning the entire operation. Even inside prison, there are rules, unwritten codes, and hurting children breaks every single one of them. Santos finally told everyone what the streets had always known, what the cops had ignored. After Emily's escape, Eli had gone looking for her. He combed through homeless encampments, interrogated street kids. It was obsessive. Carl confirmed the worst. He'd followed Eli's trail, and he was the one who found Emily's body first. Carl's transformation struck a chord, especially with the younger inmates. He started teaching them during yard time, told them how to recognize a trafficker, what kind of language they used, what kinds of lies they told. His informal classes grew. He was turning knowledge into a weapon against the next generation of predators. The Vietnamese gang threw in their support after their leader discovered Eli had targeted girls in their community. It had been deliberate, manipulating language barriers, exploiting immigration fears. 3 girls from their neighborhood were still missing. Red tried to retaliate, painting Carl as a killer, but no one was buying it anymore. The truth about Emily had spread too far. The more Red ranted, the more isolated he became. His empire started collapsing from the inside. Even the prison chaplain, who had stayed carefully neutral for years, finally spoke up. He'd seen Carl's medical records, seen the injuries, the neglect, the deliberate withholding of treatment. Even a man of faith couldn't stomach that level of injustice. He began using his pull with the administration to advocate for real medical care. Carl's reputation had changed completely. No longer seen as a predator, he was recognized for what he really was, a father who'd done what the system refused to. Men who had once beaten him now shielded him. Guards who tortured him now avoided eye contact. Rodriguez, who worked in the kitchen, had been there the day Red ordered the hit on Carl. He'd heard every word, remembered every detail. Now he was sharing that with other inmates, creating a network of witnesses Red couldn't silence. The truth had been unleashed, and it was unstoppable. My release date was just days away, but I was torn. I could walk out, go home to my daughter, and leave it all behind. Or I could risk everything to make sure Carl lived long enough for justice to find him. My little girl needed me, but so did the memory of Emily. So did every victim who never got their day in court. Red's grip on power finally slipped during a public outburst in the yard. In his rage, he referred to Emily and the others as inventory, merchandise. In that moment, even his own crew stepped back. They finally saw what he really was, and they were disgusted. It wasn't just about Carl and Red anymore. It was about every Emily who'd been swallowed by the system, every family who never got answers, every life destroyed while the powerful looked away. The prison had become a courtroom, and the failures of an entire society were finally on trial. Carl changed. He found strength, not from revenge, but from purpose. He stopped calling out Eli's name in his sleep. He started eating again, participating in routines. He forgave, not his son, but himself. And that gave him a reason to live. Key inmates began turning down Red's dirty commissary credits and protection deals. His offers no longer held weight. Conscience, a rare currency in a place like this.
In prison, conscience is a rare commodity. But suddenly, it was more valuable than any commissary credit or bribe. Men who'd once sold their souls for favors now found their limits. Even the corrupt guards began backing away from Red. Being tied to child trafficking wasn't just bad optics, it was career-ending poison. The protection racket Red had run for years began to unravel. Guards who'd once laid hands on Carl now turned their eyes when inmates stepped in to protect him. Then came a small but meaningful shift. Carl received real medical care for the first time since arriving. The night nurse, knowing full well the risk, cleaned and dressed his wounds properly. She gave him real antibiotics, not expired scraps. She documented everything accurately, without falsification. It was the first real act of human decency he'd seen from anyone in authority. Healing began, both physically and emotionally. Red, desperate and crumbling, made one last offer. He said he'd confess. He'd admit to his part in Eli's operation, but only if Carl agreed to recant everything. To say Eli was innocent, to say Emily never existed, to admit it was all a fantasy. That offer told Carl everything he needed to know. Red wasn't afraid of Carl. He was afraid of the truth. Carl laughed, a sound sharp and liberating, like chains breaking. He knew Red's confession wouldn't undo what had been done. But the fact that Red offered it meant the truth had already begun to burn its way out. Outside the prison, Eli's victims were being identified. Families were speaking up, asking questions. The entire network, the lawyers, the money men, the law enforcement shields, was collapsing. Red's outside contacts dropped him en masse. His attorney stopped answering calls. Wire transfers were frozen. Everyone abandoned ship. He was radioactive. Inside, the prison's social order realigned completely. The Muslim Brotherhood welcomed Carl into their prayer circle, something unheard of considering the normal racial boundaries in prison life. They saw him not as a symbol, but as a father, a man who made impossible choices in the name of love. Then came the most unexpected shift. The Aryan crew declared Carl under protection. Their leader had 3 daughters on the outside, And even in that brutal place, fatherhood trumped ideology. Sworn enemies now found common ground in shared humanity. Carl used everything he'd gathered, every testimony, every lead, to piece together the full scale of Eli's crimes. It was horrifying in its precision. Over 30 victims confirmed. More names were emerging by the week. And then, a breakthrough. Carl remembered something Eli had said during their last confrontation, how he kept detailed records as insurance against his partners. Those records, Eli had said, were hidden at the family cabin, the same one where Carl used to take him fishing, before everything went wrong. Carl couldn't just send the location outright. It would get flagged. So he began writing letters to his lawyer. Coded, layered, built like breadcrumbs in a trail only the determined could follow. Weeks passed. Then it happened. Evidence surfaced. Handwritten notes from Detective Harmon found in a safety deposit box during an unrelated case. Bribes, dates, case numbers. Clear, damning proof of systemic corruption. Then a guard, one who'd worked there for 15 years, approached Carl during morning count. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Prosecutors had finally searched Eli's old apartment, tipped off anonymously. Inside, they found what Carl had described, detailed records Eli had kept on every victim, every deal, every partner. Insurance turned into confession. And Red? He'd been judged by the block, not by a court, by men who knew sin, but also knew the difference between crime and evil. There are lines you don't cross. Red had crossed them all. During lunch, it came to a head. Red, now desperate and alone, struck. He'd been sharpening a spoon handle into a crude blade over several days, hid it in his waistband, and as Carl reached for his tray, he lunged. The shank sank deep into Carl's side, right at the kidney. Blood poured across the floor, mixing with spilled food. Carl collapsed instantly. I caught him and dropped to my knees, pressing down on the wound with all the strength I had left.
My hands pressed hard against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding while Red loomed over us, spewing lies to anyone within earshot. He claimed self-defense, said Carl had threatened him first, that this was justified retaliation for the burns Carl had given him months ago. The guard started demanding statements. Witnesses hesitated, torn between telling the truth and surviving the fallout. The corrupt officers dangled bribes, commissary credits, extra phone time, even early release for anyone willing to support Red's story. But something had changed. The block's conscience had awakened. I stayed locked in place, holding Carl's side together as blood pooled beneath us. Medical staff loitered at the edge of the room, stalling. The guards had clearly ordered them to wait. Let him bleed out. Each second stretched like a lifetime. Carl's voice faded, whispering one name over and over. Emily. Emily. That was when I made the call. I screamed across the cafeteria that Red had just confessed, loud enough for everyone to hear. I shouted that he'd admitted to supplying Eli with victims, that he bragged about it while stabbing Carl. The room shifted instantly. The hesitation broke. Inmates who'd been on the fence suddenly stood up. They started yelling their own truths, what they'd heard, what they knew. Shouts echoed off the walls, not just about Red, but about the system that had allowed this to happen. The whole cafeteria turned. Guards stepped back as inmates surged forward, surrounding Red. I never left Carl's side. I kept pressure on the wound as the circle closed in. There were 50 of us to every one of them. Even guards who weren't dirty knew better than to step in now. To protect Red meant marking themselves as accomplices. The room was boiling with fury. Red screamed that Carl had made everything up, that Eli was innocent, that Emily never existed. But then William stepped forward. From his pocket, he pulled out Emily's missing person flyer. The photo was worn, edges frayed, but her face was clear. A 9-year-old girl who never made it home. And that silenced Red. Until Santos stepped up. He didn't shout. He just told the last, ugliest piece of truth. That Red had his sister, worked as a counselor in juvenile detention. She picked the targets, vulnerable girls, the kind no one would look for right away. Runaways, kids with no families. She passed their names to Red. Red gave them to Eli. They didn't stand a chance. Big Tom stepped forward. The room went still. He spoke with authority that needed no explanation. Every crew, every gang, every lone wolf on the block had voted. Even Red's own crew had stepped back. The verdict was unanimous. Carl, pale and trembling on the floor, lifted a hand. With effort that looked like it might kill him, he motioned for Tom to stop. He asked only one thing, that Red live with what he'd done. He said death would be too easy. Even dying, Carl still chose mercy. But prison has its own justice, and mercy doesn't always apply. This wasn't the world outside. Here, crimes against children carried a sentence no one could overturn. The block had decided. Red knew it too. He reached for one last weapon. A razor blade melted into a toothbrush handle, hidden in his sock. With wild, frenzied desperation, he rushed at Carl, willing to die as long as he could take Carl with him. The charge was clumsy, driven by panic, not precision. He slipped on spilled food, lost his footing, and veered off course. Carl, barely conscious, lifted his food tray, a flimsy shield, but momentum did the rest. The blade bounced off the tray's edge and, redirected by Red's own force, plunged straight into his throat. Red collapsed beside Carl, clutching at his neck as blood sprayed across the tile. He bled out fast, faster than Carl. His lifeblood soaked into the same cafeteria floor he tried to turn into a killing ground. And just like that, it was over.
His last words were a wet, choking attempt to say Emily didn't matter, just another product. But the words gurgled into silence, unfinished and unheard by most. Carl survived, but only because the media arrived at exactly the right moment. The smuggled calls I'd made to journalists over the past few days finally paid off. A reporter already investigating prison corruption had received my messages. He was looking into the systematic denial of medical care, and he was asking questions right when Red launched his final attack. That outside pressure changed everything. The administration couldn't risk another death, not with a journalist circling. Suddenly, medical staff arrived, this time with the right tools, proper equipment. Carl was stabilized quickly and efficiently, given the same care they'd withheld for weeks. Sometimes exposure doesn't fix systems, but it makes their failures too expensive to continue. Red died unmourned. Doctors worked quietly on Carl as the cafeteria emptied. The rhythm of prison life resumed as inmates returned to their cells. Red's body was removed without ceremony, another casualty of the violence he helped create. The official report listed it as self-defense, and in truth it was. Final barriers to Carl's recovery dissolved quickly. The guards who'd protected Red, the ones running side hustles and protection rackets, saw the writing on the wall. Investigations were coming. Rather than face scrutiny, many requested transfers. Their replacements were carefully vetted, officers with clean records and no interest in the old ways. A new equilibrium took shape within the block. When Carl was strong enough to leave the infirmary, he didn't waste time. He became a teacher, not formally, but during yard time, at meals, in quiet moments. He taught the younger guys how traffickers worked, what signs to look for, what tactics they used, how they picked their targets. His classes weren't official, but they were always full. My release date finally came just as Carl was regaining strength. He'd undergone multiple surgeries and was expected to make a full recovery. The emotional scars would take longer, but he'd found a reason to stay alive. He had purpose, to protect others from what Emily and so many others had endured. On my last morning inside, Carl handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a detailed letter addressed to law enforcement. It included directions to the family cabin, the one where Eli had hidden his insurance records. Carl listed dates, names, account numbers, everything. He also included contacts for families of other victims, people who deserved closure. The letter was more than information. It was insurance. If anything happened to him, the truth would still surface. I walked out of prison with Carl's letter in hand and a promise weighing on my shoulders. Emily's story would reach the right people. Carl would serve the rest of his sentence with dignity, surrounded by men who now understood what the courts never had. Red's death was ruled self-defense. The block was safer now, free from the rot that had poisoned it for so long. Some sins can't be forgiven, But some fathers, those who know what it means to love without limits, understood why Carl had done what he did. We both carry our daughters in our hearts, and we both face what comes next, not with pride, but with purpose. The system failed Emily. It failed all of them. But Carl made sure Eli would never hurt another child again. It wasn't justice in the legal sense, but it was resolution, the only one left after every proper channel had been twisted or closed. The prison walls that once trapped Carl now shielded him from those who'd wanted Eli's crimes buried. Inside, he found a strange kind of community. Fathers, survivors, men who saw his truth. And outside, I carried that truth toward whatever justice might still be possible.